Hello, my name is Stephen Baines. I've worked in education development for some 30 years or so. My presentation today is on school improvement. My think piece on school improvement takes as its starting point a particular school visit I made to a school somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. It examines the general challenges exemplified by this single instance. It acknowledges that raising standards at scale in resource-poor environments is not easy. But the essential starting point in tackling the problem is to admit that there is a problem. There's a need to establish consensus on what school improvement means and how this affects the direction of effort and the allocation of resources. Some of the remedies that have been tried in the past have only scratched the surface. They've been too short-term, too diffuse in their objectives, and too aspirational in relation to the resources available to sustain any changes made. The think piece concludes in the hope that integrated approaches to school improvement will be adopted, as much through public pressure as through government initiative, and that these approaches will avoid repeating the ineffective efforts of the past. The school I visited was having problems maintaining quality in the face of rapid demographic change, an expansion of access, and low and uncertain levels of funding. Inadequate and erratic government funding meant that most of the available funds were devoted to the payment of salaries and simply maintained an underperforming system. There were high rates of teacher absenteeism. These are often symptoms of low levels of motivation, ineffective management, and a general lack of accountability. Nothing in the head teacher's experience or prior training had prepared him for a leadership role, and he didn't see himself as a professional leader. The school supervisor who accompanied me on the visit saw his role primarily as ensuring administrative compliance on behalf of the local education authority. He visited schools very infrequently. I was only able to come on the visit because the agency that was funding my visit also gave him a travel allowance. The school lacked a sense of purpose. An increased number of children attended the school, but they appeared to be learning very little. Gaining access to school had not satisfied their right to an education. They were in a holding pen, wasting time. Low contact time, lack of stimulation, poor levels of service, and low expectations were accepted as the norm. The specific challenges faced by the school in my example are not unusual. Although the particular nature and degree of intensity of the problems may vary, they are indicative of more general challenges that inhibit school improvement everywhere. So what is school improvement? Well, it's the process by which schools become more effective, leading to better student outcomes, not just in academic terms, but in terms of developing the social and cultural well-being of the children and adults within the school. This requires conscious efforts to raise school achievements by modifying classroom practices and adapting management arrangements to support teaching and learning. Much of what we know about school improvement borrows from research into school effectiveness, and this is heavily influenced by the experience of economically developed countries. However, in some degree, schools everywhere face similar challenges. As one of the main proponents of school improvement, David Hopkins has put it, raising levels of achievement, enhancing the learning repertoires of students, and the creation of powerful learning experiences are educational challenges that are independent of GDP. In the literature, there are several models for school improvement. None of them are entirely satisfactory on their own. But what we can gather from this is that school improvement is a product of both in-school changes and changes in the supporting environment. The idea of developing the whole school and its environment of support networks is a familiar theme and one that informs most school improvement initiatives. For example, UNICEF's Child-Friendly Schools model. One of the problems with thinking about school improvement is that it's quite a slippery concept. It's not a finite state of being, but a continuous process. An improved school can always do better, and if it stops moving forward, it's likely to go backwards. In the literature, what's regarded as important to school improvement has changed over time. Generally speaking, the literature on school improvement identifies the ingredients, but doesn't provide the recipe. Some initiatives developed under the umbrella of school improvement do not seem to have had much impact on students' learning or teachers' classroom practices. One example of this is the mass program of in-service teacher upgrading. In Indonesia, they have a lovely phrase, "Deduk dengar duit," which literally means sit, hear, money. In other words, sit passively and collect your per diem allowance. Quite a lot of the thinking around school development planning, which you would expect to be something to do with school improvement, is actually often more to do with community participation and the functions of school committees than changes in the classroom. And quite a lot of the thinking on school grants, the decentralised finance to schools, doesn't. Most education authorities can point to model schools. They use these as exemplars of dynamic leadership, better financial management, or close ties to the community. These successes, however, depend on a concentration of resources and effort. Things tend to get better if there are clear and well understood objectives and multiple coordinated inputs are applied. Much more elusive is the goal of improving schools generally, on a self-sustaining basis and on a scale necessary to cope with the challenges of population growth, resource constraints, and the need for high levels of knowledge and skills in a changing world. School improvement is resource intensive, requiring clarity of purpose and coordinated effort. The problem is that the wider its central messages are disseminated and the thinner the available resources and capacity are spread, the weaker are the ensuing benefits. Governments in poor countries face a dilemma. They can accept that scarce resources and limited capacity mean that to be effective, school improvement strategies have to be restricted in scope or geography, or rolled out over a very long period. Or they can dilute the solution and hope for the best. By wanting to do more, or wanting to do something for everyone, they tend to underestimate the depth of the problems they're addressing, imagine unrealistic rates of change, or assume unlikely levels of future funding. Measures aimed at school improvement are often diluted to increase the number of schools or divided up in ways that reduce impact. What starts as an integrated package of school improvement measures becomes a series of separate activities. Overambitious government initiatives are often encouraged by pressure from external donors who are keen to disperse funds. The development industry operates a funding cycle that is not really well suited to the long timescales involved in transforming schools at scale and driving up learning outcomes on a sustained trajectory. Donors' limited time horizons and their need to show results encourages inconsistency. They either stick with tried and tested approaches that are only partially successful, or they ditch these and follow development fashions that promise new solutions, which tend to be more exciting and more professionally interesting. So, what is necessary to a school improvement strategy? Well, a number of basic things. First of all, context matters. Schools aren't all the same, and they're often in different levels of development, have different needs, etc., and shouldn't be treated as a homogeneous mass. Having said that, improvement tends to come through movement on several fronts simultaneously. So there's a need for coherent approaches that combine different activities. There's a need for consensus to raise the level of expectation, marshal public support, and allow hard economic choices to be made. Gearing public opinion behind a campaign for better schools could be a force for change. I come back to this towards the end. It's important, I think, to see the school as the unit of change. And the people within the school, we should remember, are the ones who have to do the hard work of changing. And ironically, it's often these people who are the least well informed about what's going on. If we're expecting schools to make an effort to change, then it follows that they need the freedom to be able to do that. They need greater autonomy. But together with that comes the obligation for greater accountability. And the last point here is that children's learning has to be kept as the central purpose of school improvement. What does this mean in practice? Well, it means that you need more inspired school management, higher standards of teacher professionalism, higher expectations on schools, backed by a more supportive supervisory function, and a more demanding inspection regime. So if those are some of the basic principles on which school improvement should happen, how will change come about? Well, I think we've seen that improvement initiatives are often insufficiently focused on children's learning, too disparate in their objectives and approaches, too short-term, too dependent on government initiative, and too opaque to catch the public imagination. Now, I'd like to come back to this idea of government initiative. No school improvement strategy would be possible without government initiative to drive change in schools. But governments alone have a mixed track record when it comes to improving schools. Political direction from above needs to be complemented by bottom-up pressure for change. The theme of this think piece has been that school improvement is difficult and there are no instant solutions. This is hardly cutting-edge thinking. School improvement is a prolonged and continuous uphill struggle and is dependent on political will, funding and human capacity. This makes it particularly difficult for impoverished countries with growing populations and underdeveloped governmental capacity. In the absence of clear political leadership and reform-minded state institutions, pressure for change has to come through enhanced public consciousness of the parlous state of education and the consequences of not doing anything about it. Gearing up public opinion is not easy for development agencies. It's not their natural territory, as they see their main aim as supporting governments. Governments rarely welcome this sort of intervention, seeing it as destabilizing interference. However, the prize for donor-assisted school improvement would come from successfully igniting public concern while at the same time co-opting government to ride the wave of public support by actively engaging in reform. This would mean committing both internal and external funding to support integrated approaches intelligently aimed at transforming schools.